Cool. Thank you for coming to the session. All 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and about 12 of you. It is a Friday afternoon, so that's more than double what I thought we'd get. So we're here today to talk about how we can build mobile applications with Xamarin and an Azure backend. Who here has used Xamarin before? Awesome. Who's used Azure before? Or Azure, depending on how you want to say it. Great stuff. We'll be focused mostly on platform as a service with app service, and Rich is going to be covering the first half, which is the backend, and he'll show you how you can create a new backend and deploy it. And then we'll switch over to me, and I'll be showing you the front end, which is a fun little application that I've been building called Bait News. It's in the App Store right now if you want version 1, which this is a picture of. What we're going to actually work on today is version 2. Which adds some new features. The premise of this application is to pull in various headlines from numerous sources, like the Daily Mail, the Daily Mash, the Onion, as well as going into places like Not the Onion, which is a Reddit subreddit, and finding all the amusing headlines and getting them added. And then we showed it to you in a Tinder-type application where you swipe left or right, depending on whether you think that's a real headline or you think it's a fake headline. So it's a pretty simple app, but we've got authentication in there as well, and obviously it works offline. And with that, shall we show them how we can build something like this?
Why not? So we made a decision to share the Mac about 3 minutes ago. So whether everything's already on there and set up to go, we shall find out. So here I've got my Azure portal. I've already kind of logged in and got everything ready to go so that we don't waste time with the 15 different login windows that you get when you go into Azure these days. Here's I've got an app service. Who's sort of actually played around with Azure App Service for mobile? Anyone sort of had a little play? Good. So what I want to do now is, as a mobile developer and you know, someone who basically just writes apps, what I want to be able to do is push data to the cloud, pull data from the cloud, and not really care about what goes on in the back end. I don't want to have to spend all my time building out, you know, a big kind of back-end ASP.NET solution, or, you know, spend a lot of time configuring back-end databases and all the scalability that goes into that. I just want to be able to say, I need some data, give me some data. And that's really what we're going to look at today when we build out the back end that's going to drive Mike's app. So I'm going to go into my little menu here. So I'm in my app service, and I'm going to look for this thing here under the mobile section, which is called Easy Tables. Let's give that a second. We are on Wi-Fi, aren't we? Yeah. Give it a second more. There we go. So what I've got here is the ability to just spin up Azure SQL back tables in a matter of seconds. And the way I'm going to do that today is I'm going to take an Excel spreadsheet. So Mike's app, as he mentioned, is built around strange headlines that you might find either in the Daily Mail or elsewhere. And we're going to try and determine whether they're real headlines or whether they are somewhat fake. Sometimes with the Daily Mail it's hard to tell the difference, but that's the whole point of the app, really. So I've got an Excel spreadsheet here, and I'm just going to save this now as a comma-separated file. And I'll just call it, even though it's going to put an extension, I'll just put that on there just so that I can remember what it is. And it's just going to tell me that it's going to remove a few formatting features. And now I'm going to go over to my portal, and I'm going to say, let's add this comma-separated file to create a new database table. So go into my folder, find my CSV file, open it, and you can see what it's done already is that it's had a go at working out what the table schema is going to be. So I've only got 4 columns in this table. I've got it's initially set them all to string. So I've got the text of the headline. I've got the URL that the headline, the actual real news story on the internet. I've got is it true, so which is going to be a Boolean value. So let's change that to a bool. And I've got the source. And the source is just going to be a text string, which is going to be kind of Daily Mail, Daily Mash, The Onion, that kind of thing. And now all I'm going to do, I'm just going to take that little extension that I put on earlier, and I'm going to upload that. And it's going to import that into Azure. And there's my table. And you can see that what Azure's done is actually it's also added a whole bunch of other columns. So we've got our created at update timestamps. We've got some version there. And it's also generated a globally unique ID. So we've got a GUID as well. And then we've also got one extra column right at the end there, which is the deleted column, which allows us to do things like soft delete. So we can actually flag something as being deleted, but not actually remove it from the table. So, pretty quick and easy to create a back-end SQL database. Now, it's got a little bit going for it, but perhaps what the difficult bit now is we need to build some kind of web service around this. We need to have some kind of web API that we can then start, making HTTP requests to the database, pulling down JSON, and being able to then deserialize that in our application. So, under normal circumstances, this might take a bit of time. In this particular case, it's already done. So if I now go to my browser again, and I go to, let me just remember what I called this. I do hope you've cleared your browsing history before we... Xamarin.
Computer is used for very little, so apart from development, so you'll just find me sitting on Stack Overflow or Reddit.
Actually,
or you can kind of see what my most popular things to do are.
Let's just go back to my web service, and then we can get it that way. It's going to be much quicker.
So you mentioned that when you've got these easy tables, that you've now got this web service that's run up around that. That's using Node.js, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, but it's codeless, so you don't really need to know any JavaScript or be able to build do any code on the back end. Obviously, there's the opportunity to do that if you want to do something like, for example, trying to think of a good example. Let's say you're integrating with something like Azure Notification Hubs, and you wanted to have it so that every time you did a table insert, it automatically triggered a notification that went out to mobile devices. Then you might need to write just a little bit of JavaScript in the back end to hook those two services up together. But what we can see here is that my web service is up and running. So this is my app service. And now I can go tables, headlines. I think I did call it headlines, didn't I?
Yeah, I think it was headlines.
Yeah. Well, we'll find out in a moment. And the first thing it tells me is that I need to specify the API version. So I'm going to put that in. I think it's still 2.0.0.
And this Zumo API version in your header that you have to provide is really useful to make sure that Google doesn't crawl your endpoint. So Google isn't going to get access to this because their crawlers won't have the header required. But for testing, you're going to need it.
Okay, so there's the contents of my table. And now I can start writing filters against it. So I can say, using an OData specification, I can say filter equals, and let's pull out everything that has a source. The source column is equal to, what have we got? How about the onion? And there you go, there's our JSON. So not only, just by simply uploading a comma-separated file to Azure, it's not only created an Azure SQL-backed database for me, but it's also given me a full REST API that I can now start querying. Now, I have written apps before that just literally use the raw endpoints and just pull data out and deserialize the JSON. But a much easier way to do this is to use some of the NuGet packages that come from Microsoft to be able to sort of wrap these APIs so that you've got a much more consistent way to query your data, and you can run things like link queries across them. And that's really what Mike's going to do next. So that's where he's going to pick up. So, God, that was the quickest I've ever done it.
Perfect.
I think I'm done. So I'm going to take a step back now. You can probably kill my mic for the moment, and Mike's going to take over.
That's an 11-minute back-end demo.
Fantastic.
Look at that.
I'm going to the pub.
I wish all back-ends could be built in 11 minutes. Don't feel obliged to stick around. Richard's daughter's birthday today, so honestly, don't feel obliged to stay and watch this if you want to dash home and be with loved ones rather than watching me. So this is the front end. We've got our back end now deployed. So we've got a REST API with an array of headlines that we can go and fetch. Now, Rich uploaded that from a CSV file, which was generated in Excel, which is exactly how I did this for the first version of this app, which is in the App Store today. I'm using Easy Tables, and it uses the Node.js backend in App Service. But in terms of actually storing that data, it's just going to SQL Azure. So this can scale to millions and millions of requests without any problems. There is another option if you're doing a quick start within App Service to have just a SQL-like database. It's going to save you a little bit of money, and it's going to be quicker on the deployment as well. But actually, you're never going to want to release a production app that uses a SQL-like database in your backend. You're going to want a proper database of some description. So the second version of Bait News, which we're going to see today, actually has a full ASP.NET backend, which speaks to SQL. And if we have a bit of time, I'll pull up the source code for this. I'll need to switch over to my Windows laptop to show you that, because I do all of my ASP.NET development in Visual Studio. I do all of my mobile development in Xamarin Studio, which has now been tweaked to be called Visual Studio with some new features, but it's still in preview. So consuming the back end. I'm going to show you the SDK, where we can get it, what it can do. I'm going to talk about how we can set up our mobile app to consume this REST API that we've just created. How do we work with that data? And then we'll have a look at authentication as well. So the SDKs. All you need to know. There are two main Azure Client SDKs if you want to interact with App Service. Now, these just wrap a REST API. So you don't have to use these SDKs if you don't want to. You can just go and call straight to the REST APIs like Rich showed, where you're going to get some data back. Now, I would only ever suggest that route is if you didn't want offline and you're a bit of an animal. But if you're not an animal and you want offline, you're going to want the SDKs. Now, to have offline support, you want to search for Azure Mobile SQLite Store, and that's going to grab all the dependencies you need. If you want online only, so there's no capability for offline sync, then you just grab the Azure Mobile Client SDK. And that way, any CRUD operations that you do on these tables, you're going to need to be connected to the internet, and it's going to send that payload off to Azure, and it's actually going to run that change on the SQL server. With the SQLite Store, all of the CRUD operations you make are actually happening on a local SQLite database, which has got a copy of the data. Now, in terms of what data you sync down to device, it's a pretty interesting topic to talk about, because you're not going to want to sync everything. Within Bait News, I only sync one user into the user table, and that's a currently signed in user. But I sync all headlines down to the device. When you add a headline within Bait News, I add it to the local SQLite database, and then at a later time, I'll go ahead and sync that back up to the cloud. Obviously, if I was online only, I wouldn't be able to just store it offline and sync at a later date. Some more useful SDKs that I find myself using in most of my Xamarin apps that consume Azure is Azure Storage. There's a great use case within Bait News for this, in that my profile page, I use Facebook to authenticate, and I grab the profile picture. Well, what I want to do is take that photo, store it in Azure Storage, so that I'm then not reliant on constantly having to refresh my Facebook token in order to just load a little photo. We've got notification SDKs for Notification Hub, Project Oxford Vision SDK. This should really be called Cognitive Services, but when we go into NuGet and we're searching for the Cognitive Services SDKs, a lot of them are called Project Oxford. And that's because Cognitive Services is Project Oxford, and Project Oxford was a research project within Microsoft Research, which they've only just started to commercialize. And thus, a lot of the SDKs that we use still use the old naming convention. And then lastly, Azure Search. If your application has large amounts of data, you're going to want to be able to search it, and Azure Search is a managed instance of Elasticsearch. It's very, very quick. It's very, very cheap, and I don't build many apps without adding in Azure Search now. Now, it is an online-only API. The way to get around doing offline with something like Azure Search would be to use a service locator or dependency injection and swap out the implementation depending on your connectivity. So if you're online, you're going to call into Azure Search. If you're offline, you would have an offline version, which is just going to search through your table. Maybe a little link statement where it's going to go and find this item contains this string. So you can grab these NuGet packages. You can grab these from NuGet because they are NuGet packages. You can also grab them from GitHub or our component store. They're full Xamarin support, so you can run it on Xamarin iOS, Xamarin Android. The online-only SDK you can run on Xamarin Mac as well. There's no technical reason why offline wouldn't work with Xamarin Mac, but nobody's implemented it yet. As I say, it's open source, so if anyone here really wants to build Mac applications with Azure that are offline, please do put in a pull request. We'll always accept them if they're good enough. The SDK is extremely flexible. It's not forcing you down any avenues or assuming that you've chosen any particular technologies. And we'll touch on this when we look at a little library that I've written that sits on top of this SDK. It's very, very flexible, but it can be a little bit intimidating. If anybody's used Parse, anyone used a Parse server? One. Perfect. Well, you'll know how easy the SDK is. It's almost idiot-proof. It's really, really simple. Has anyone used Firebase? No one. Well, that's even better because that's Google and boo. Firebase, the Google guys hired a lot of the Parse guys. Parse guys, to me, is the way that you should build easy-to-consume web backends for mobile. The SDKs are just lovely. The Azure SDK is nothing like that. The Azure SDK is a beast. But you can distill it down to small sections which are good, which we've done with the App Service Helper library. So setting up your app, you're going to need to init the SDK, and that isn't actually the line that you want to use to init it. Well, I'll show you that in a moment. But you're going to want to initialize the offline storage, so the SQLite storage, as well as just set up for that platform. Now, depending on what platform you're on, there are a couple of lines to get this started for you. On iOS, it's 2 lines of code. For Android and UWP, it's just 1 line of code to initialize it. The reason you're going to want to initialize it is to stop things like our linker coming in and getting rid of classes that you're actually going to need. Our linker obviously removes bits of your code base that it thinks you're not using. If it doesn't detect that you're using parts of the SDK, it will strip it out, which is the last thing we want. Here we go. Here's the real code. So we need to create our mobile client. Our mobile client is like our entry point to anything that we want to do within the SDK. And we're going to pass in the URL for our backend. So in my case, it's going to be HTTPS because we want to be secure. No HTTP here. So https://baitnews.azurewebsites.net. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and create my tables. In this case, you can see I've got the iMobile Service sync table. Sync table means that it's offline. This supports offline, and it's going to everything we do with this table, so all the CRUD operations, the add, remove, the patch, that's all happening on the local SQLite database, and then we'll sync that back to Azure at a later point. If I wanted this to be online only, and I'd gone with that first NuGet package, which isn't the SQLite store, this iMobile Service sync table would change to iMobile Service table. That's the only change you need to make to take this online only versus offline. Once you've created your tables, you need to define where you're storing the database. It's just SQLite. And then you need to set up some sync context. Now, this is just kind of boilerplate code that I don't think we should be having to write as .NET developers. I think this should be abstracted away from us because it's not that complicated. It's just useless code, if you ask me. Then we have querying local data. So much like Rich did with the OData filters, we can filter the data that we're returning from the tables. And remember, this is all coming from that SQLite store. And here we have some link on the to-do table. So you can see we've got the loveliness of link. Relationship advice. This one's really important, especially with things that are meant to be proof of concepts and meant to be very quick. It's very, very easy to get round references with your relationships within Azure. And this is something I've found myself doing a lot with beer drinking, which caused me no end of issues, is that I would have a beer have a child that would be a review, but the review would have a child that would be the same beer. And so it would be, I'd have auto expand on. So when I'd ask for that beer, it would just keep expanding on the back end and it would never return the objects because it's just inflating and inflating and inflating. Keep it simple with your relationships where you can. What I've done with Bait News is rather than having a reference to the actual object, so being like a virtual answer to the headline, I just have an answer ID, and I know that I will have stored that answer offline so that we can very, very quickly go and look up that ID on the device at runtime rather than having to actually expand it and send it down with the initial query. So that's a very, very brief intro to the official SDK, and I want to show you the easier way of building or consuming Azure from your mobile apps, and that's App Service Helper Library. And this is a library that I wrote with Piers Bogan. This came out of a couple of apps that we built for Microsoft. So build 2016, we had the My Driving demo. It was a little app built for UWP, Android, and iOS. Had an OBD connector, so you can plug it into your car, and it's going to stream that data up to IoT Hub. We're going to run machine learning on it, and then it also gets fed into an app service, which we can sync down to the device to show you where you've driven and some performance stats on that. The architecture we used for that, we then reused for the Evolve application, which is a conference app built with Xamarin Forms. That same architecture was used in beer drinking, and then we used it again in the cycle demo that we've created, and we've just been recycling this architecture over and over again because we created it with the Azure team, as well as some of our best engineers within Xamarin. And so Piers and I looked at this architecture, and we found that there's a lot of code reuse that we could take out and put into a separate library. And that's exactly what we did with App Service Helpers. So it reduces the number of lines of code you need to write to interact with Azure down to 4. That's all you need, 4 lines of code, and you're good to go. So it's built on top of the standard Azure Mobile SDK. Now, it does have the dependency on the offline. You can't do online only with this, so we're only really targeting mobile, so iOS, Android, and UWP. It's modular architecture, so you can pick and choose which bits of the SDK do you want to use. So you can drop down into that low-level Azure SDK if you really want to, or you can stick with a very high-level abstraction within App Service Helpers. It's available on NuGet, and it's open source, and it's very opinionated about the technologies that you've used to build your apps. It's assuming that you're using Azure SQL on the back end. It's assuming that you're using entity data or entity framework and that your objects are inheriting from entity data. If that isn't true, this framework isn't helpful. But for 99.9% of our customers, I see them using SQL Azure, I see them using entity framework, and this could reduce the number of lines they write from hundreds down to just a handful. So this is how you get started, and this is with version 1, so the stable version. Version 2 slightly tweaked, or version 1.1 I should say, slightly tweaked, in that we also have a static version of the Easy Mobile Service client so that you can access it from anywhere within your app without having to new up a new instance. So we create our new Easy Mobile Service client. We initialize it with our URL, just like we would the standard SDK. We're then going to go ahead and register our objects. Now, in this case, I'm registering headline. Headline here is inheriting from entity data. Now, that class entity data isn't coming from entity framework like you would expect. It's actually a class that we roll within App Service Helpers so that you can easily share that model on the back end and the front end. So once we've registered all of our objects, and in the second version of Bait News, which we'll be showing, we have headlines, users, and answers. We then need to finalize the schema to say, we're done. That's all the objects that we're going to be using with the database. And then we're good to go to start actually consuming Azure from the SDK. You can download it today on GitHub, mycodes.net, App Service Helpers. You can grab the code. As I say, you can also grab this from NuGet. I'd suggest grabbing the 1.1 preview 13, I think it is. So I want to show you App Service Helpers now. We'll get rid of that. Can you all see the code? Even the dude at the back can see it. Perfect. So this is just a standard iOS application. This is bait news. It's not Xamarin Forms. This is a traditional style app. This is how I like to build all of my applications. This is also on GitHub. So if you want to go and grab the code for this, feel free, download it, send in PRs. This version is version 2. You can see V2, so you'll want to find the branch for that. The default branch, obviously being master, is just V1 at the moment, which is the version in the App Store. So if we come into the app delegate, which is the main entry point for any iOS application, you're going to see I've got this finish launching method, which I've overridden. And this is where I'm going to set up my application. Now, the first thing I want to do is if I'm in debug, I want to remove any data that I've got stored within NS user defaults. NS user defaults is where we store our app settings. It's not a very secure way of storing your app settings, but it is a very easy way to secure your app settings. Now, in my case, I'm storing my Facebook user ID and my Facebook expiry date, token expiry date, and my Facebook token string within the user defaults. And I check on launch if I've got any values in there, then I can go ahead and create an access token and authorize from pre-existing data. But when I'm in debug, I don't want to just assume that the app's always going to work through the auth flow. So I want to re-authenticate every single time. So I just get rid of all of the pre-existing data when I'm in debug. And then if we come down to 45, or line 46, I should say, you can see this new API. So you can see Easy Mobile Service client.current.initialize. We pass in our endpoint URL. We go ahead and we register our tables. So in this case, we've got headline, user, and answers. And then we finalize. We go to declaration for the headline. You'll see I'm inheriting from entity data. But this is exactly the same data that Rich was having in his spreadsheet. If we follow this, as I say, this isn't going to go to Entity Framework. I wouldn't want you to have to install the entirety of Entity Framework as a dependency to get one class. So you can see we have our ID, date time offset. Oh, let's pop back. So updated app, we have our version. These are required in order to make offline sync work. Azure is expecting these, but you shouldn't have to add these manually to each class that you have, so you just inherit from app service helpers, and you're good to go. Once I've finalized the schema, that's all I need to do in the finish launching method, and then it's just a case of getting the app to look a little bit prettier. In terms of the data usage, we'll go into the swipe game view controller. So you can see on line 41, I'm actually going to set my headlines to have some data. And I'm using this new type, which is a connected observable collection. Now, a connected observable collection comes from App Service Helper Library version 1.1 Preview 13. It's a catchy thing. This allows you to have, effectively, a connected observable collection. It's an observable collection that any CRUD operation you do on it, we're eventually going to sync back to Azure. Now, when I say eventually, we'll do it when we want. You don't really have too much say in it unless you call the API yourself to force the table to sync. But by default, we'll handle it for you. By default, we'll handle merge conflicts by taking the latest takes precedence. Again, we're going to just take all of these things that you would normally have to roll your own, and we abstract it away to make it a little bit easier for you. So I create the connected observable collection, and then I've got my list of headlines that I can start using within the actual app. So you can see it's very, very easy to go and fetch data from Azure. I've just had to define some tables in my app startup, and then I just say I want to create a connected observable collection. It's going to go ahead and it's going to fetch that object from the backend, so it will fetch all the headlines, and it will give it to me in an extension of observable collection, or an extended observable collection, I should say. So let's get this running so you can see how it looks. And even if you don't like the idea of taking on a dependency such as app service helpers, which I completely understand, you shouldn't just willy-nilly take on a dependency. You should give it a lot of thought. As I say, a lot of the code that's come from this has just been made more generic to reuse in other apps, but it's come from multiple different apps that we've built. So you can just come in and take the classes that you want. If you only want a connected observable collection, just come in and grab that and get rid of the rest. Now, I will say, if you do add the dependency and you're only using connected observable collection, let's go through the breakpoints. If you're only using a connected observable collection, then our linker will get rid of the rest of the code that you don't touch. So that's important. Your app binary size isn't going to be massively inflated by taking on these kind of dependencies. So this might be, we'll skip through the auth. I've got a auth, but I'll talk about it in a moment how we've done this. There we go. And we double check that we're authenticated, which we are. So we can start playing this game. If I hit start, we're going to call into this swipe table view controller, swipe game controller up here, and we'll call into the connected observable collection. So if I go ahead and let's actually see where we're using this. So we refresh the headlines down here, so let's have a look. Pop that there. Hit start. We've not hit our breakpoint yet, which is, we've already loaded. That'll be why. Perfect. So we have our headline, which we pulled in from Azure. Again, I've not written any code to sync with this. It's literally 5 lines of code to get to this point. It was the 4 to get everything initialized, and then 1 to just go off and fetch this. And the 1 to fetch it is just a connected observable collection. So we have our headline. Ramonas should stop moaning, insist people who've spent their lives moaning. Now, this is a Tinder-style application, so we can drag. And we drag this way if it's real, and we drag this way if it's fake. So which way do you suggest we drag this? Is this real? Show of hands for a real headline. 1 person thinks real. Show of hands for fake. Most people think fake. It is a fake headline. So we scroll off to this side. Boom, and we bring in the next card ready to go. Woman 63 becomes pregnant in mouth with baby squid after eating calamari. Real? That's quite a lot of reals. Fake? Oh, it's about 50-50. That's a real headline. That's a Daily Mail. And we'll do the last one. 12-year-old pulls gun on classmate over chicken nuggets. Real? Yeah, that's a real one. It's really depressing, isn't it? You get the idea. We've pulled in some data. I'm going to get rid of this. No, actually, we'll talk about auth next and why I do that and have those breakpoints in. Very, very simple to do all of this, adding CRUD operations to Azure. We can come in here and we can say a brand new headline, http hello world.co.uk, me, and then we can post it, and we failed the operation. But that's gone into my local storage. So although that hasn't synced up to the cloud for some reason, I could have just dropped off the internet for that brief second. That's now stored on my local SQLite database, so that when I do get next connected to the internet, that push operation isn't going to fail, and it's going to sync back up to the internet, and that headline will be available for everybody else to consume. Yep. No, Azure's going to deal, for the most part, with retry for you on bad network connectivity, but once it's gone ahead and said that this is failed, it's failed, and you'll need to deal with the retry logic on it. Now, my advice would be, if you're building for an offline app, you don't really need to tell the user that that's failed. I've got errors popping up to tell me it's failed because I'm still in development, and I don't want to just have to look in the console logs. I just want to be able to see straight away. You should always build to be offline. So that's failed. I shouldn't show the user that it's failed. I should just keep it in the offline storage and at a later date sync it when I can. Now, if you're constantly failing, maybe you want to put in that if there's 10 attempts to try and resend this and it's not, then I might want to prompt the user. But I think that it's bad form to build an app around being offline and then constantly poke the user and be like, you're offline. Because they know they're offline, because they probably only came to your app because their favorite app didn't work, because it wasn't on the internet. So I want to talk a little bit about authentication and permissions. So let's stop being lazy and let's do this right. Who has used social authentication? So that's like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, I guess, if perfect. Have you done that using the WebView auth, where you bring up a little web view and you type in your username and your password to sign in? Nobody's done that. Are you using the native SDKs? Well, Rich has done it. Anyone using the native SDKs? Okay, so that's 2 of you. There were still people who've authenticated with these services who have no idea how they're doing it. They're not doing it with web, and they're not doing it with native SDKs. Interesting. So the standard way that we suggest at Microsoft to authenticate your users within App Service is wrong. We know it's wrong. We tell people it's wrong. And yet whenever you watch someone from Microsoft present on how to do it, they'll show you the wrong version because it's easy. And it doesn't go wrong very often. So it's very easy to demo. You have a couple of options to authenticate your applications with an app service by default. You have Google, you have Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and Active Directory. You can also plug in your own security provider or auth provider. So if you've got custom authentication, say we had it for Xamarin at the Xamarin Evolve, you can sign up with your Xamarin account. We still authenticated with Azure App Service, but it was all just custom. Today I'm going to be showing you Facebook authentication, but with the native SDK, rather than the WebView approach. So this is what we call server-side authentication, and this is that WebView authentication. So we're effectively asking the Azure SDK to do the auth for us. And what it's going to do is it's going to pop up a WebView with the Facebook website or the Google sign-in page. And you're going to type in your username and password like an animal, and you're going to hit OK, and it's going to sign you in, and eventually you'll get a user returned to you. Now, this isn't going to return a Facebook user to you. It's going to return to you an app service user. So you're going to have a token that isn't the Facebook token. So if you try and send that token that you get back through this call up to Facebook, they'll go, that's not ours. Don't know where you got that from. And you'll be rejected. The user ID you get back will be the user ID of the app service user, not the Facebook user. It's basically a black box. You'll never get the token back from Facebook unless you write custom code on the back end. This is a very hard approach to debug. If you're doing testing properly, your back end will be in different stages. So you'll have a staging, or slots, I should say. You'll have staging, and you'd have production as a minimum. Facebook authentication deals with redirect URLs, which will change depending on which slot you deploy to. So if I deploy to staging, this stops working because my redirect URL is going to come from production because I can't turn authentication off on production. So it just becomes a real nightmare. So this is the worst way to do authentication, but it's just one line of code. So everyone does it this way. But please stop. So I'm suggesting, and Microsoft as a whole suggests, but doesn't show, that we use native SDKs. And you can find these from like Google and Facebook. And the Facebook one is a real delight to use, especially kind of version 3 onwards. Version 2 of the SDK was pretty difficult. It was effectively just that web view. But they've done an awful lot since version 3. So why use a native SDK? Well, they're going to deal with things like token refresh for you. By default, you're going to get a token that lasts for 60 days, and they will securely store it on the device using keychain. You don't have to do any code to deal with how to store that token or how to refresh it. It's just done for you. You're going to get a lot of options to interact with the Facebook Graph API in a type-safe way, which is something I like. I don't like to work without type safety. But it also can dramatically impact the adoption rate of your application. So there are 4 possible authentication options if we look at mobile, and iOS in particular. So we have the iOS native, that should be login, not logic dialog. Login dialog, which is unique to iOS 6. Is anyone here still supporting iOS 6? Perfect. So you don't need that. But if you did need to support it, you would need to roll your own version of, make sure that you call down into this API yourself. Facebook deal with that for you. We have fast app switching to the Facebook native app. This is the way that everybody wants to authenticate. You hit sign in, swap out to the Facebook app, show me the app that it's still correct. Yeah, that's still bait news. Okay, I accept. And then you switch back into the app that you initially came from. That is the best user experience to authenticate your mobile apps. Then you have fast app switch to Safari, which we'll see in the simulator here, because obviously in the simulator I don't have the Facebook app installed, so it can't switch to that. So it falls back to the SF Safari View controller, which has access to all my cookies and data from my main browser. So I'm already signed into Facebook, so it's still just a nice click to just sign in. And then lastly, we have the one-liner, the horrible approach which we need to stop using, which is just a web-based login. So we're going to be aiming for the two middle ones here, so fast app switching to native app when we're on iOS 9, iOS 7, 8, and 9, iOS 10, they're doing some A/B testing to decide between switch to Safari or native app. They haven't decided, Facebook, which one they're going to choose yet, but if you're on iOS 10, you may get either, which is quite exciting. So the Facebook SDK component, kind of like this. You've got three separate areas. You've got the core, which is where you're going to be doing most of your work, so to get your authentication to happen and to deal with your current session and restoring tokens and all of that loveliness. Then you have the Graph API, which contains a lot of interfaces so that you can get that type safety to deal with the Facebook graph. And then you have some native UI, so you can have very easy access to logging in. In fact, when I click the sign in or the login button within Bait News, that is coming from this SDK. That is a Facebook type, and they handle with a full auth from that moment on, because I'm using the Facebook login view. I could also use a Facebook friend picker, so if I wanted to add a social element to this, so you can go and easily add your friends, boom, it's just an API call. And then I can add native Facebook share sheets and things to my application as well. So it's not just authentication that you're unlocking and dealing with token refresh and storing it securely on all the devices. You're unlocking a whole load of other features that you can add to your mobile app to make it more social. You can get it from our component store, which is available on both PC and the Mac. And obviously this SDK supports iOS and Android. I believe there is a UWP SDK in the works as well. You can also grab these packages from NuGet as well. I'd actually recommend grabbing them from the component store instead of NuGet, just because the team that maintains that binding works for the component store rather than mainly publishing to NuGet. It's kind of an afterthought. So I'll show you through that authentication approach. So to do that, I'm going to close all of these, and we'll quit the app. And in fact, let's be really brave. I'll start this running on the simulator, but whilst it's doing it, I might just plug in my phone and share the screen off that. So if any horrible text messages come in, then it is very brave. But it may, if we're lucky, because I'm on iOS 10, it may show us the native app switching. So it just shows you that the same code on the simulator is going to call into either the web view or the native app. D&D, do not disturb, that takes all the fun out of it. It's not a good presentation if you don't have some concerns about losing your job. So we'll plug the phone in. But I'll talk to you about what's going on here. So I mentioned right at the beginning that when I'm in debug, I want to get rid of that pre-stored information. I want to force to refresh my authentication token and to check that my auth logic works. So what I've done is in the viewDidAppear method, which I've overridden, which is a standard method that comes from UI views or UI table view controllers, or anything really that's a UI view controller in iOS. I say within that, okay, I've become visible. Have I got stored within my settings a Facebook token? And if I do, well, then I've authenticated before, and I can probably re-authenticate with the backend with that existing token. If I don't have that token, then I need to get the user to authenticate. So in this case, I had that if debug, and I went and cleared NS user defaults. So we can see ooh, that's most peculiar. So I'm seeing the pop-up on the screen here, which isn't showing there. Oh, no, it is. Sorry, my mistake. Bad eyes. So you can see my string is empty, it's got nothing. So then we're going to execute down into the authentication prompt view controller. So we're going to new up a new instance of this view controller, and then we'll show it on the screen, which you can see here. This Facebook button comes from the Facebook SDK. That's in that top tier of UI controls. All I've got within my view is a button that is exactly the same size. And in my view did load for this, if we scroll to the top, view did appear. You can see my BTN auth button I make hidden. But before I've done that, I've created this login view button, or login button, and I've given it the frame for the button that I'm just about to hide. So I can basically swap my button for the Facebook button, which just makes the designing of this UI a little bit easier. Now when I click, when I click login and we complete that login process, we're going to call off to this login view completed method, which is where things can get a bit fun. So I've got some errors. So if we have some errors within the login, that's bad for us, and we need to fix that. I then go ahead and authenticate with the backend. If we come into here, and when I say authenticate with the backend, I'm re-authenticating. So I've authenticated with Facebook, and I said, yes, this is Mike James. This is confirmed to be him. But I don't really care about myself too much. What I care about is authenticating with app service. So I pass that token off to app service, and they go, yep, that's still Mike James, but we've created a user profile for him, and these are going to be his answers and how we track them, and this is his new user ID, and that's how we'll refer to me from forever on. So we create our token here as a J object. We pass in the token string, and then we simply call, and you can see this is calling down Easy Mobile Service Client, current mobile service. Mobile service is just the standard mobile service class that comes with Azure SDK. So this is me dropping down into the low-level API, because app service assumes that you're not doing authentication properly. App service assumes that you're cheating and you're doing it the bad way, so the API only exposes the bad way, but I needed access to a lower-level API, so I just get the instance of mobile service, I call login async, pass in my Facebook token that I got from the mobile SDK, and we're good to go. So if we then come back to, once we've returned from there, we have our user. We then go ahead and set our preferences, so that NS user defaults get set here. And once we've done that, we create and save the user. Creating and saving the user is literally just newing up a new user instance, setting the properties from the Facebook details. You can see it here. So Facebook ID, we get it from the Facebook SDK. We get the first name, last name. We get the profile image URL. And then we set some defaults. And we throw that into our user table, which is just from Ash. And we're good to go. So you can see we create the user table. We add the item down here after we've synced it. And then we go ahead and we sync it again. So that's nice and simple. The big thing with authentication in the Facebook profile is that once you've authenticated with Facebook, you don't care about any of that data anymore. You populate your users and you throw this into Azure. And from that point onwards, I only really care about the Azure token and how I keep track of that. Now, within app service helpers, we will keep track of the tokens that get sent back, and we actually use Xamarin Auth to store those securely on the device for you. So again, it's just another little abstraction within the app service helpers library to avoid you having to deal with token refresh and how to store those tokens securely on each different platform. So you only really care about this access token on the first ever instance of launching the app. And once you've done that, we only care about Azure at that point. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else particularly amusing within this app or interesting to show you. Aha. We have 10 minutes. So I will very briefly talk about ASP.NET versus Easy Tables. And why did I move off Easy Tables, which is V1? If you go to danknews.azurewebsites.net, you will find the V1 API. Everything is open. In fact, I've even left CRUD operations open to anyone. You don't have to be authorized or authenticated to go in and add headlines to my backend. Super bad practice. Never do that. With V2, I wanted to add the ability to scrape places like the Daily Mail and to pull in headlines and have web jobs. And I knew I needed to be writing some C# to do that. I didn't want to use JavaScript for it. And I got quite far with Easy Tables. My version 1 of the app is in the App Store. People are downloading it and using it. It's working. But I wanted more, and JavaScript isn't for me. So I rolled the full ASP.NET backend. And it's not a particularly complex backend in terms of the code I wrote. If we come over to GitHub, I'll do it in the browser. That's going to be easiest. Beer drinking backend is private because I published all of my publishing details within this repository, so you can actually go and hack my Azure if you had this. Hence why I kept it private. This is beer drinking. This isn't the one we wanted. Bait news backend. So we're coming to my data objects, and you're going to see basically the same thing that you saw before. We have everything inheriting from entity data, so I can just drag and drop this from my front end to the back end, and I've already got some code reuse there, which is very nice. To actually interact with these come from the controllers. So when I'm asking for all of the headlines, I'm calling up to, where is it? Get headline and get all headlines. Here we go, and we just return the query. Now this is just created for you. When you've got your data objects within Visual Studio, and you want to create a new controller, you go into the controller directory, you right-click and you say Add New, you say I want it to be a controller, and they'll say, is this an MVC5 controller, or an Azure controller, a table controller, an API controller? And you'll say, I want a table controller, and you'll pass in, select the type headline, and it's going to scaffold all of this for you. I've not done any editing apart from, for the post headlines, I just checked that we don't already have a headline with the same URL in the database. And if we do, I return null, which is pretty bad practice, but it works. I catch it on the client, and then I just log into application insights that I've discarded an entry. So you can grab the entirety of this project, as it's a work in progress, from mikecodes.net Bait News. Now for V2, with all the auth, with the Facebook SDK, with App Service 1.1 Preview 13, I think it is, with the connected observable collection and all of that goodness, you'll find that in V2. V1 is a version that you'll find on the App Store, which is a very, very much condensed version without any social aspects. Are there any questions? Nothing. Well, to be fair, it is gone 5 on a Friday. I can think of places I'd rather be. Well, we have 7 minutes, so we can either leave early or we can all find questions.
Just maybe to point out that maybe Mike sort of reference the fact that this stuff is, really kind of if you need offline sync, and if you kind of want to have all that kind of offline goodness caching local data on the device. Even if you don't really need that kind of capability, we have a lot of people, I know a lot of developers that still use some of these, for example, like the Azure SQLite Store package, because of all of your CRUD operations are on a local database on the device, you get a much better performance increase than having to do all your writes to the cloud. You're not constantly pulling and pushing data all the time. So even if you don't need that kind of offline capability, and even if you've got something that perhaps, you've got people walking around a warehouse and they're always going to be on good Wi-Fi and everything else, because you're not constantly calling out to the internet all the time and hitting the cloud, then that package is still a great option for you. So, don't think of it just in terms of, am I going to be constantly online, or am I going to need to kind of have offline capabilities? There's something there for everybody. Yeah, because by default, when you ask to get all items, it's going to return the first 50 items out of your database because it does paging. So if you're constantly saying, hey, I want to get all the headlines, please, so I've just loaded up the headline swipe view controller, and now I'm having to call off to Azure and do a round trip to return those 50 headlines. Well, that's quite a lot of wasted bandwidth when I can do it once, store it on the device, and have them forever. So yeah, it's, as Rich says, and quite right, it's not just about unlocking offline, it's about increasing the performance of your application, or at least perceived performance. Because you've still got to send that data, it's just you can throw it in a background thread when the user isn't actually waiting for it. You can fetch it before they need it, and you can sync it when they don't need it.
And you can make rules as well to say, I only want to sync on Wi-Fi, I don't want to sync on 2Gs or 3Gs to make it even faster. You had a question?
So is the Azure Mobile Client SDK, is that say is fully featured in HTTP clients?
Yeah, so it depends what platform you're on, depending on the underlying implementation, but it does rely on HTTP client. Yeah, once you get all the way down in terms of the way that Mono works on iOS, you'll end up with an NS URL session. So that you can use things like ATP, which is app transport security. I should clarify what that is. Apple's thing about everything's got to be secure now. We're fully compliant with it all, and it all just works. There's no extra work that you have to do because you're talking to Azure versus any other web service that you would talk to. Yep, very simple to do. In fact, my colleague Adrian Hall has an amazing web book on this. It's a little ebook. So if you check him out, Adrian Hall, he's the senior program manager for App Service. And we've managed since the acquisition to get him to be a big Xamarin fan, which is fantastic because he was a Cordova man. Poor soul. So he is currently writing an ebook which is free. You can go and grab this from the website, and it's just a wealth of information. So if you want to know about things like custom headers within the client SDK, check out this. And most importantly, check out that. Yeah. As I say, it's had a lot of Xamarins. You've got James Montemagno up there as well, and Piers Bogan. We've all been helping him get this book off the ground. So it's a really, really good resource. So if you're not sure about the back end, check this out. If you're confident on the back end but you're not sure about the front end, check this out. So, two questions. Okay, I'll go with you first, and then I'll come to you. Yep. It's not a new feature. What you effectively end up doing is creating an API controller that you talk to Azure, and then that will then forward it onto your auth service, and that will return back whether or not the user is authenticated. So it kind of sits as middleware between your authentication provider and the client. I will show you where you can find an example of this. So if you do GitHub, Xamarin, Evolve, this project here uses custom auth, and you'll find both the front end with Xamarin Forms for UWP, iOS, and Android, and then the back end is built using App Service. So you'll find all the code you need to do custom auth properly and securely within this project. Okay. You can, but the general advice is to avoid showing a web view because that's where most phishing attacks happen. Because they've shown a fake version of the Facebook login, or they can show a fake version of your login screen and just send the data and do man-in-the-middle attacks. And it's a whole world of badness in general. But if you do have custom auth, then you're probably going to want to have some kind of view where you send off the passwords and the username. So, as I say, I would check out the sample, this sample, because we show how to do it securely, which is the most important bit when you're doing auth. I always suggest not to do auth yourself. You shouldn't really have your own auth service. You should be relying on somebody else. But we all write hideous code every now and again, so I will allow it. There was another question. You'll have to ask it to sync. So you're going to ask it to either do a push or a pull. So you tend to want to do a pull before you do a push. So to fetch all of the data and then sync the stuff that I've got. That's in the standard SDK, you manage that yourself. With App Service Helper Library, we manage that for you.
It'll also do all your kind of conflict resolution as well. So if somebody else has written to the table and you kind of have an update that goes kind of, out of sequence with something else, it'll take care of a lot of that for you.
Cool. Well, I think we're finished. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Richard, for starting us off with easy tables. Welcome.